Hope he's not in trouble.
I was going to say, I might be.
Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Christopher Such.
Hello again.
And Neil Almond.
Hello.
And in this episode, we're going to focus our attention on the murky world of English orthography. But first, Chris, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
This week, I've had the pleasure of rereading Anne Sullivan's book, Access to Phonics, which is a practical guide to the teaching of phonics for pupils with complex needs. As part of my role outside of the consultancy stuff I do, I had the chance to speak to Anne for an hour or so. She generously gave up her time, and it was fascinating. I learned lots of things that I had no idea about, how to support pupils with really complex needs in early reading, ideas that I never would have come to on my own. And this book, thankfully, is a repository of her wisdom on this subject and her experience. And for anyone who teaches pupils with complex needs, I think it's a treasure trove, highly recommended. And, you know, Anne Sullivan's brilliant. The work she does is brilliant. And this book is likely to be useful to a lot of people. What about you, Neil? What are you reading for?
So I am staying on theme of the podcast, and I've gone through the trove of morphology papers that I had in my little folder, and I revisited How Morphology Impacts Reading and Spelling, Advancing the Role of Morphology in Models of Literacy Development, and that is by Levesque, Breadmore, and Deacon. What I like about this paper is that you get the abstract, as you would normally lay out, and then before they get into the meat of it, they literally have in subheadings what's already known about this topic, what this paper adds, and then another subheading of implications for theory, practice, and policy. And I just think for the time poor but enthusiastic, rich teacher, if all academic papers could just go, this is what we already know about this is what this paper adds, and these are what we think the implications are, and then nerdier people can then go into the detail and actually work out whether those conclusions are actually matched with what the study's actually done. So just to let you know what they feel this paper adds to the kind of literature of morphology in terms of reading and spelling is that they've used recent empirical evidence to specify the multiple roles of morphology in literacy development, and they kind of present this morphological pathway framework which identifies explicit mechanisms between morphology and literacy skills, and it kind of guides its inclusion then into theory and practice. So a little interesting paper for sure. Kieran, what about you? What are you reading for?
Nice. I mean, this week's been pretty hot on the things that have been worth reading online. And I thought I could guess what all three of them would be, but neither of those were on my list. So I'm going to keep the other two for another time. I think I'm going to have to give a nod towards Michael Pershin's sort of blog on multiplication and the key facts. You know, if you're not subscribed to Pershmeal, it's a Substack worth subscribing to. And I think he's really caught the zeitgeist with his question and answer format that he's delivered in his most recent sort of blog post in. So, well worth checking out. And I know it's not on topic, but, you know. I mean, I think I can work out the answer to the first question because I know that ortho is Latin for teeth, graph is Latin for picture. So I'm guessing we're talking about teeth pictures. So, but for anyone who's not sure, what is an orthography?
Yeah, well, we're obviously we're not needed here with your expertise. No. Orthos, Greek for correct, graphia, again, Greek root suggesting writing or drawing, and so orthography meaning correct writing or drawing, which raises the question, how do we define in something that is based on social conventions, like all aspects of language are, what is correct? And I've already answered the question. It's down to social conventions. So when we're talking about an orthography, we're talking about the socially agreed upon conventions of a writing system. So in other words, English orthography, which is what I imagine we'll be talking most about today, is the correct way, as it were, to write in English.
It would be a real diversion if Kieran at this point said, no, we're going to talk about like Latin orthography.
Yeah, we're going to start talking about abugidas. We're going to talk about syllabic orthographies.
Yeah, nothing really to add. As I say, my notes for this one are literally ortho means correct, graphy is writing. So it's just the correct form instead of like representing writing or representing speech, capturing that in writing. I like the word form because it links quite nicely to a bit of morphology as well. That comes later on where you look at what morphology actually means. Morph is about this derivative of form. So I quite like having the word form there when I'm explaining what orthography is, because it kind of makes that nice little connection there between morphology as well. But as I say, apart from that, nailed it.
When we're talking about the conventions of a writing system, mostly what we end up talking about is spelling, but there are obviously other things that are part of an orthography. So things that we might take for granted. So in English, for example, we take for granted that we write words from left to right. Not the case in other orthographies, that we leave gaps between words, that we go down the page. That kind of stuff is all part of the agreed upon conventions. But because the most complicated and often most interesting part of these conventions are about how individual words are spelled, the word orthography often ends up becoming a synonym, not just for the conventions of a writing system, but very specifically the conventions of a spelling system. And so you'll have to forgive us through this podcast today if at points we seem to be using both, because that does tend to be how the word orthography is used. But if in doubt, we're probably mostly talking about this idea of it being relating to a spelling, the way that words are spelled, rather than the bits of orthography that we take for granted.
How does English orthography compare to other orthographies?
So English is sort of remarkable in its structure in that I think it's the deepest orthographic depth of any language that's been thought of by humans, because they might be out there. What I would say, and also then when you compare that to what we mean by that essentially is that there are multiple ways with which we can represent the sounds of speech to correctly write words. Contrast that with some other languages such as Finnish, which has the shallowest orthography because they have pretty much a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of the abstract squiggly symbols that they use that represent particular sounds. I think what's also quite interesting as well is that, as well as it having kind of a deep orthographic depth, it also has quite a complex syllabic structure with it as well. There's a nice little paper by Seymour and Erskine, who kind of quite nicely put this into a nice little table where you can kind of see how English compares to other European languages, which kind of definitely shows English being the most the deepest of orthographic depth, and also kind of the most complex in terms of its syllabic structure. So yeah, straight away, and it's quite a useful thing to know, I think, because quite often you hear people, whether they be people within education or people outside of education, who go, oh, but in Finland they come to school at the age of 7, and they learn to read English and they learn to read Finnish, which undoubtedly is true. But what's important to kind of note is that because that system is so simple in the Finnish language, is that by the age of 7 they pretty much come to school already being able to read their own language, because it is not as complex as English. And so that's why it's quite a good rebuttal for that kind of idea as to why children should perhaps start school later in England, because actually it takes that much more longer to understand and learn our kind of the structures of spelling that we have within English.
So if I may, I'll try and put the sensible, really good stuff that Neil's described there into maybe a slightly wider context. So generally, I mean, there are lots of ways to represent spoken language, and the common types are generally kind of the way that they're most commonly divided up is into like logographic, syllabic, and alphabetic. And effectively, logographic language, written languages, or should I say, logographic orthographies, are orthographies where at the heart of the writing system, the individual words or morphemes, which are kind of chunks of meaning, that they're represented by symbols. That's a logographic orthography. Now, there are no purely logographic orthographies. People think Chinese, for example, is. It isn't. It also represents sounds, but it certainly involves logographs, single symbols that represent words or morphemes, these chunks of meaning. So that there are also syllabic orthographies. Now, those, the kind of the chunk of sound that they are representing in the writing system is the syllable. So, for example, the Japanese orthography represents syllables using symbols called kana, which are divided into, I think, hiragana and katakana, but effectively they're called kana. But these symbols represent syllables. And it's a great idea because there are roughly 100 spoken syllables in Japanese. Going back to what Neil said, though, when we come to something like English, we require this third kind, what's known as like an alphabetic orthography, an orthography that doesn't represent or doesn't have symbols that represent morphemes or words, doesn't have symbols for the grain size, as it were, of syllables, but instead has symbols that represent phonemes. And this is what makes an alphabetic orthography like English. It's a writing system where the chunk of sound around which that writing system has been built is the smallest chunk of sound that can separate two words, which we call the phoneme. So there are lots of different writing systems. I mean, it's worth noting, somewhere between a syllabic and an alphabetic orthography, there's a bit of overlap between those two in orthographies like Hebrew and Arabic, because they have if you represent all the sounds, they have an alphabetic structure, but then they don't always represent all of the sounds, especially for text that's used by fluent readers. But in short, English is this alphabetic orthography. It represents the phonemes, what we can think of as the smallest chunks of sound rather than something larger. And it does that, as Neil says, because of some of the particular complexities of English as an Indo-European language. If we wanted to represent English in a syllabic form, we would need thousands upon thousands of symbols, because there are thousands upon thousands of potential syllables. The writing system has to marry up with the spoken language in some way. So we end up with an alphabetic writing system in which phonemes are being represented by symbols, which we call graphemes, which are the smallest meaningful unit of contrast in a writing system. Just finally, to kind of tie up what Neil said, so he started talking about the depth of orthography, and he's bang on the money that English has a uniquely deep alphabetic orthography, with things like Estonian and Finnish and Italian and Welsh at the other end of the spectrum, and French somewhere in the middle. So we don't have this lovely, neat and tidy one-to-one correspondence between phonemes and graphemes. We've got something much more complex, which, as we'll discuss, has significant impact on how we need to teach this stuff.
When we say Finnish is easier, and then the kids coming able to read, it's not so much for an outsider, though. Is that right? I want to make sure that we cover all bases on arguments that get made when this conversation is happening, because rather you say it now than have to spend your whole weekend tweeting what what the actual.
Yeah, well, the nature of learning to read is you are connecting the symbols on a page to the spoken language that you are acquiring through it. And because the development of spoken language is biologically primary, that's the recognizing the symbols and the connections between those and sound is kind of the initially, at least, the tricky bit. And that tricky bit isn't as tricky in Finnish. But there are no free lunches here. So, like, if we take a language like Slovak, for example, really easy to initially learn to recognize words because the relationships between letters and sounds are pretty easy to work out. It's close to a one-to-one correspondence. It's got a shallow orthography, but then you've got other complexities in the writing system. So we mentioned earlier this idea of morphemes, these chunks of meaning. That's quite useful in English because these chunks of meaning can help us work out the meanings of words. That kind of stuff isn't quite so embedded in stuff like Slovak. So learning the meanings is more difficult. And equally, it's much more complex in how verb endings change and the way that nouns change and the way that there's gender within the language. So when we talk about English being really complex, it is complex in many ways, but the choke point, almost the point of greatest complexity in English, is that initial learning to recognize words. Those are initial connections between letters and sounds, between graphemes and phonemes. That's where English is like really complex, and that's what we mean by saying it has a uniquely deep orthography. But down the line, there are other difficulties when it comes to learning to read other languages. It's just that first initial word recognition that is particularly challenging in English. And if I may, an example of how that plays out is that in English, for example, in the first few years of pupils learning to recognize words, we identify word reading difficulties by things like accuracy, because like your average reader is still struggling with 20-30% of words that they might come across even after they've been reading for 2 or 3 years. If you contrast that with a shallow orthography like German, after a year you are judging reading difficulties almost purely on pace, because every word can be pretty easily decoded once you've learned the basic relationships between letters and sounds. So yeah, it has pretty major implications for learning to read, and it's different between languages.
Cool. I mean, I wasn't necessarily going to keep that in the podcast. I was just going to see if Neil wanted to add anything, but that seems pretty important.
The only thing I'll add, and it's not that important, but it can get cut, is that in terms of logographs, if you want an example of that, the pound sign is a really good example of what a logograph is. That is actually still part of our English writing system. We see that sign, and straight away we know that sign stands for pound. So Chris's explanation is always spot on, but if you wanted a worked example, a real world example of what that actually is, then I'll throw that one into you as well.
Yeah, and even going beyond kind of like mathematical symbols, like the ampersand is a great example of a logograph, because it literally represents a word and a morpheme, because it's a single monomorphemic word. It's really, really lovely example.
Yeah, I'm definitely not deleting that, Neil. That's a really good one. Yeah, ampersand used to be and per se and at the end of the alphabet. Is that right?
Possibly. If it is, I've just learned something new.
Yeah, like that.
I think it was an additional letter. It was a letter at one point. And you would have X, Y, Z and per se and. Don't ask me why. So Neil, to what extent is English orthography a representation of spoken language?
This is the one I imagine maybe Chris and I might disagree with. I'm not sure. Be interesting to see where this one goes. So the real answer is that it depends, because Chris said it is literally a social construct of how you want to go about organizing these principles of how to make this incredibly complex language that we have and the writing systems that we use to represent it transparent for children that are learning it. Many phonics schemes have their own way of trying to, and that's effectively what phonics is, and I'm sure Chris will hopefully agree with this part, is that phonics is just how do we represent this English language in a way that doesn't overwhelm children when they first start to read. And so obviously most phonics programs, if not all phonics programs that I'm certainly aware of, they kind of try to hide some of this orthographic depth by creating a false code where literally we pretend that there is this kind of one-to-one correspondence. And so obviously in that state, then at that point, English orthography mirrors exactly what spoken language is. And as that kind of, we introduce that complexity where we start to have things where the same spelling has different sounds, or where different sounds can have the same spelling, then that's where I certainly thought, well, there's a nice easy explanation for this. We can just say, well, letters are represented, sounds can be spelled with either 1 letter, 2 letters, 3 letters, or 4 letters, and just kind of through a lot of practice, we can then sort of orthographically map, and we can use a bit of context when we're reading it to understand what this word might mean in this particular sentence. That tells us what, so if we're seeing, I had cheese on my bread, we know that the EA is the air and not one of the other representations that it could be. However, the more I kind of talk with Chris and various other people who are far more expert than I, there are certainly some sort of complications within that, in part because of the etymology of some of the words that we have. So what we mean by etymology is the history of that word and where that word has come from. So many, nice easy one, knight is in like a knight in shining armor, used to be in Middle English, I think, might be in Old English, knicht. And so the K sound was, very adamant and there at the beginning. Over time, language has evolved because language, although, say, totally, social construct, seems to have some sort of biological element to it in that it does evolve over time and grows. You could put, I think on a podcast I listened to, it's about 1,000 years worth of difference between someone being able to understand the same language. So someone who was here in the year 1000 wouldn't necessarily be able to understand what we're saying right now because it just sounds so differently, because language evolves over time as weird and wonderful things happen. And I'm sure we'll go into a bit more depth on that later on. So the argument is then, well, right now we don't we don't pronounce the K in night. So actually, are we happy with just telling children that, well, we can just say that here it's 2 letters, this K and the N now spell this one sound of N, move on? Or actually, is it the right thing actually to say, well, actually, this is what I think it's called like an etymological marker, where it's telling us that at one point this was pronounced as K-N and Knicht. It's the I sound changed ever so slightly because of the great vowel shift. And whether that's something worth teaching about. Now, I'm not, for some words, I think I am, but I think for some words like knight and gnome, gnat, I think I'm quite happy with just saying, 2 letters, 1 sound. It used to be sounded out, now we don't. But for me, kind of this false representation that we provide students, I think is absolutely fine. And really, it's a nice thing. The teachers might know that the K was pronounced, the G in nat used to be pronounced. Some teachers don't. Does it prevent children from actually developing and moving on with their spelling? I'm not sure that it does massively. And so I think this is where Chris and I might disagree slightly on some things. I'm not sure.
The few things you mentioned there, because obviously I'm thinking 1,000 years ago, Normans hadn't yet invaded England or the British Isles. And on last week's Teaching Together podcast, I was talking to Dave Taylor about numbers to 20. And obviously the numbers between 11 and 20 are impacted slightly by a little bit of what you were talking about there. And I was also talking about how over time vowels stretch or they contract, and that possibly happened with things like 13. Do you think the printing press has had an impact and it will slow the rate at which this is happening down? And so in 3023, do you reckon we'll still have a closer version of English? Because I think if you look at Scottish and Irvine Welsh, it's English, but it's not really. And I think if we, what do you think?
2 things. Yes, I think it probably will slow it down, although certainly, since the printing press in the 13th, 14th century, I think around that time.
In terms of English, printing press a lot was brought into Britain by Caxton in the late 1400s.
So evidently, since then you've had like Shakespeare plays, and obviously Shakespeare plays, we can read Shakespeare plays. We might be able to make pretty good educated guesses if you're literate, but they were printed in large-ish numbers, as well as, Samuel Johnson's dictionary was printed at one point. It was the most popular book in the world, but still language has evolved. So will it slow it down? Yes, I think obviously because far more is printed, not only, literally, but also kind of through social media and the internet and the World Wide Web. It will slow it down. But a lot of the reason why we, going back to that second question we had, why is English orthography as deep as it is? One of the many reasons is because of the printing press and decisions that were made by people who ran the printing houses at the time, purely because, for various reasons. One, because they themselves were of, Danish descent, and so they changed a few things around to some, practical things like, we can't fit this spelling, within the space that we have, so let's chuck something out. And then obviously, various books with different spellings didn't survive, insert whatever invasion, fire, events, and so those are the ones that did. And I'd say because of over time, we've ended up with the system that we have got. So yes, it will slow it down, I think, but it's also a pretty large reason as to why why we have the orthographic system that we currently have right now.
Yeah, sorry for the diversion, but that could be a podcast series on its own, let alone an episode. I'd listen to that in its entirety. So Chris, back to business. To what extent is it a representation of spoken language? And Neil's added this element of tension into what's going on, what the answer is going to be. I'm excited.
Well, first thing to know, before I dive into the question, I'm sure Neil is going to want to recommend a podcast on that very topic there, one that he recommended to me that I am working my way through very slowly, but it's very good indeed. What's it called again, Neil? The one on English etymology, can you remember?
It's just called literally the History of English podcast. Fantastic. I really recommend those first. It can get very, very niche into some particular parts of it, but I just love those first, because I'm obviously a massive fan of history. I just love those first 15 episodes where we just before we even get to English, where we think about Chris mentioned this idea of Proto-Indo-European. It's one of those first Indo-European languages. They think, and I think I recommended the book that a lot of that research comes from, The Horse. I'll get the proper name and put that in properly in a minute. So the idea being that, language, first of all, started around in the Ural Mountains, so modern day Ukraine. And it was basically because of the domestication of the horse and genetic mutation that meant that people became lactose tolerant again, kind of after those initial stages of infancy, that allowed people to travel. And so obviously with travel becomes trade with different people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And just kind of how then these languages then evolved over time. And so effectively there are many languages, separated by, literal time and space. So the two obvious one, you have Latin and Greek, which you kind of understand would be very similar. Rome eventually overcame ancient Greece, and kind of so there was a lot of assimilation there of various sounds and alphabetic symbols. But also then you have this idea that Sanskrit, which is a language you usually find in India, has quite a lot of cognates, has lots of cognates to these languages as well. And so eventually, linguists kind of trace this idea that, Hellenistic, these kind of Latin Romance languages, all kind of came from this one language of Indo-European. I just find it, as a history nerd, totally fascinating how that happened. So yeah, fully the whole thing is great. I'm still working my way through it. He's still bringing stuff out, but yeah, it's the kind of podcast that I can't do it on a walk, because I just want to stop and write notes about it all. But yeah, I really enjoy it, as you might have guessed. And in fact, if you came to my Let's Talk About Spelling talk, which I did about on a couple of research days ago, the first maybe third of that podcast just literally takes us through, how English orthography got to the state that it was in. So no doubt I'll be talking a little bit about that, but not the whole thing later on. Otherwise, as I say, we'll be here for 40 minutes.
Yeah, just to say quite how niche that gets. There's a good episode which is purely about the location of Proto-Indo-European that Neil describes is identified through historical sources, through things like the fact that Proto-Indo-European seems to have a word that means honey, for example. So that must be an area of the world that has honeybees and this sort of, yeah, fascinating stuff. Back to the topic that we were talking about specifically with this question is like, to what extent is English orthography a representation of spoken language? Well, there's a larger question here, which is putting aside phonology, kind of the study of sounds, just for a moment. Like, you could make an argument that, well, the purpose of written language is purely to take a spoken language and to have it in a written form, to be able to say, look, I can point at this and I can work out what that would be in speech. And that's largely the case. But because of the nature of a writing system, because of the fact that it exists and it becomes a tool in and of itself, as we can see by the fact that we can read fluently in silence more than we can out loud in a lot of cases, because it's this tool, it ends up taking on and doing things that speech can't do. It has affordances that speech doesn't have. So an orthography, or part of an orthography, might be the way in which, you know, we underline things and have subheadings. Now, you could make an argument that that's just representing the stress that we might say, that we might put into our voice. But that's probably not the case with subheadings, really. We're doing something slightly different. Or the use of paragraphs. Is that just, oh, that represents a longer pause between two? You could argue that, but I personally make the argument that it goes beyond. Written language has affordances that spoken language doesn't have. So there are certain things that we can do with written language that we can't do with spoken language. So that's the first kind of larger question. Is it a representation of spoken language? Well, largely, but there are certain affordances that it has that means it diverges in certain ways. The second question that's kind of within that, which is, I think, largely what Neil was speaking to, and on which I largely agree, is the question of, well, to what extent is our written language representing the sounds of spoken language? And it's absolutely the case in English that largely what our writing system is doing, or a big component of what our writing system is it's taking those sounds that I mentioned earlier, phonemes, these kind of building blocks, these smallest building blocks of spoken language, and representing them using symbols. That's absolutely at the heart of our writing system. The question then is that all it's doing? And again, as I'm sure Neil agrees, it isn't. There are other things that our writing system is doing. There is morphology embedded into our writing system. And what I mean by that is that there are chunks of meaning that tend to be consistently spelled in our writing system, tend to be, not always, but tend to be consistently spelled, even when they represent they represent different sounds. So, for example, if we look at a word like nature and natural, you'll recognize, of course, they have the same underlying meaning behind those first three letters, but we pronounce one nate and one nat. Even something as common as like the past tense, we say hinted, we don't say like helped, we say helped. We pronounce that kind of morpheme on the end, this chunk of meaning that shows the past tense, in a slightly different way. And that's because our writing system isn't just representing sound, it's also representing meaning. So in answer to kind of the general question, to what extent is writing representing spoken language? Almost entirely that's what it's doing, but there are affordances that mean it can do other things. To what extent is it representing spoken sound? That's a big part of what it does, but it does more than that. And actually, that's, as Neil suggested, that's kind of one of the reasons why we end up with this deep orthography, because it isn't just representing spoken sound. Neil mentioned the word night, which, yeah, I think is a really great example of this question. And we'll talk presumably a bit about phonics later. With a word like night, presumably, well, previously pronounced something like knicht, we see this idea that phonics and making these connections is something of a best fit. English orthography is really complicated. And in most cases, the relationship between letters and sounds is pretty unambiguous. No one's going to disagree with the idea that in the word, I don't know, shop, that the S and the H are representing sh, etc. But in a word like night, it's sensible to kind of simplify things, as Neil suggests, and as phonics programs do, and say, well, like the IGH, that's just representing the I sound, as we see in light and sight and might, etc. But that is a simplification of what's going on. The GH is, or at least can be argued to be a marker of a sound that's no longer pronounced. We could argue that that now means that the IGH is just working together to represent the I sound, and that's a legitimate way to look at things. But we have to recognize that our spelling system and the connection to the sounds of our language is a best fit approach, and sometimes it's just a bit of a muddle, like a word like Wednesday. Like, we could say that the D, N, and E in the middle of that is representing the sound but it isn't really. It's just, that's just a word in which the relationship between letters and sounds is a bit of a mess. But that doesn't take away from the general point, which is that at the heart of our writing system is connections between the sounds of our language, or the sounds, the smallest sounds of our language, phonemes, and the letters that represent them.
Just to come back on that, I think Wednesday is a word where absolutely, I think it makes total sense to go down the etymological route there and be like, when the Vikings came, which I know, Kieran, is your favorite topic of history, you know, there was, they had this god called Woden, and they decided to call this day Woden's Day. And so you can clearly hear Woden, and then through, you know, sibilation, most likely, it became wed. We know we changed the woe to where, and obviously that D, then we kind of lost that as well, probably because, you know, it takes effort. And so as humans, we tend to try to, if we can, in kind of spoken language, if we can try to take some shortcuts, like naturally we will do. And that's one of the ways that language is kind of like do evolve. We just become lazy, really, which, you know, says a lot for us as a species. Absolutely, you know, like I totally agree. You know, why would we tell them that DNE is N? You know, like, it's far more interesting, I think, and makes more sense in that rare case where there is literally, it's the only one I can think of where we might, you know, say DNE is particularly, you know, this N sound. So yeah, fully on board with that part. I think particularly early on, though, you want to be as restrained with that to avoid any, you know, too much complexity too quickly. So it's a lovely one for maybe like year 3. Would I go maybe year 2? Would I, you know, have the children down at year 1 and say, right, children, today we're going to learn how to spell Wednesday, and it comes from this, you know, the Viking god named Woden's Day? Probably not. And I think that's where, you know, theory is all nice, but then you've got to think about, you know, what this looks like in classroom practice as well, and that's you know, a big part, I think, of what we as a podcast can offer.
I mean, you've already mentioned morphology, both of you, a few times. What role does morphology play in English orthography?
So, as mentioned, one of the key things that morphology is kind of like the study of morphemes. So it's worth talking about effectively what role do morphemes, these kind of building blocks, these smallest building blocks of meaning, what role do they play in our writing system? Well, the first thing to say is, well, what role do they play in spoken language? Well, by definition, spoken language is made up of these chunks of meaning. We are attempting to show meaning through the sounds that we make. The reason why morphemes are so useful is that we can talk about communication perhaps in a more convenient way at points. If we look at a word, like 2 words like I have, and then we put them together to make I've, well, in one case, we might say, under one interpretation, well, that's 2 words, and then it's 1 word. Well, is it? Morphology kind of gets rid of all that nonsense and says, well, it's still 2 morphemes. It's still kind of I, the pronoun representing me, and this VE or HAVE representing, you know, possession or have. It's still two chunks of meaning there. So morphemes, these chunks of meaning, are a really useful way to analyze spoken language and to think about language more generally. And in English, as I said earlier, the key thing is that we tend to represent these chunks of meaning relatively consistently. So the past tense is often, though not always, represented ED. Negation is often represented, or one way of talking about negation is often spelt UN. And because of that attempt to have that consistency in spelling the morpheme, we end up creating inconsistencies in the relationships between letters and sounds. So morphology, really useful for understanding the meaning of words in a lot of cases and seeing the patterns of meaning within language, but a real pain in many ways in terms of the complexities of word recognition that pupils have at the start of their journey to becoming a reader.
I think this is one where a bit of the history of the kind of English language is kind of like quite useful to understand, where it's come from, because from that you kind of understand how through those complexities, it's really useful that we've kind of carried on to this kind of unit of sound that carries meaning. So effectively, because of the history of the English Isles, like it's really just been like a whole real mismatch of, influences from religious influences, social influences, like we've talked about already, about like, the printing press, and of course, warfare and things like that. So although, most linguistics would argue that, at its core, English is a Germanic language, you kind of have to understand that there's also traces of Latin in there. And the reason that traces of Latin are in there is because obviously, Julius Caesar tried to come and conquer us and that didn't work. And obviously, we were still trading at that time with, what was then Gaul, which was in modern day France, that then, part of the Roman Empire. And obviously, Rome then, conquered ancient Greece. And so there's quite a lot, again, because of the trade that was going on there anyway, there was quite a lot of, language and borrowing from there. And so that's why, despite us having a Germanic, our core kind of root of English being Germanic, that's why you find in the sciences and mathematical subjects you still have kind of lost these Latin and Greek roots. So really kind of using photosynthesis. Photo means light. We can then extrapolate from that what photograph might be. So, okay, photo, light, graph, something to do, picture, writing. Okay, so like a light picture. Okay, that makes sense because that's how a camera actually works. And so how that then becomes, really useful for the teacher is I spent a lot of my time trying to teach children how to kind of infer the meaning of words from like the context and like reading around the word, and spend an awful lot of instructional time doing such things. We're actually, spending a little bit more time on thinking, well, here are what these morphemes mean that are pretty common. There's been a little bit of research done as to, what the most common morphemes within different, within Greek within, Greek roots, Latin roots, different kinds of derivational morphemes that come at the end of words where they, change, alter the word. Spending time teaching those, they can actually then use that to, and I mean this like properly, infer meaning rather than just taking a stab in the dark. That for me is where the real strength of teaching morphology and how we can get all of that in place really does come. And so that's where I think that's how that history has kind of really impacted English orthography, because that meaning has still transcended time and literal space. Why they're so useful and why it is something that teachers need to know about. I've no doubt that we'll debate how much of this teachers actually need to know, but really important that they do understand that because of the history of the English language. And I've not gone into the depth that it needs to, because I say that's a podcast in of itself. Just understanding that because of the influences from Latin, Greek, Norman, French, and then obviously the Vikings, that's why we have this kind of mess. But because of, again, there are various social reasons of printing presses, the Great Vowel Shift, Samuel Johnson and his dictionary, that's why we've ended up with this kind of stable-ish idea of these kind of morphemes that kind of permeate through English. And I say very useful to know. And from my experience, kids love learning about it.
Yeah, just to add something on that, it's worth noting as well that like Latin in particular is a really fascinating one, because as you say, Latin comes in through Norman French, but also in the past few centuries with the scientific revolution, you get lots of like intentional borrowing of Latin. So you often end up with slightly different words that have borrowed Latin, or two different versions of a word, both of which have borrowed Latin. One that's come in via French, and one from via Norman French, and others that have come in like been borrowed directly in, let's say, like the 19th or 18th century. So loads of Greek and Latin gets in particular into the sciences, and this kind of builds on Neil's point about the importance of teaching morphology. I think it's more than 50% of words with more than one syllable contain a Latin or Greek root. So we see the value of teaching them. Like an example of that might be tract, meaning pull, and we see the value of that in tractor, extract, retract, protractor, etc. But what's interesting as well is that this leads to some slightly odd, this fascination with Latin and Greek in the after the scientific revolution leads to some slightly odd stuff as well. So, for example, the word doubt was spelt in various ways, including like doute. A B was chucked in there to kind of nod to the Latin, or what they thought was a nod to the Latin debitum. And we see lots of these little quirks where people are trying to make links, even links that actually don't have legitimate etymology. Like the word Ireland got an S in it to match with Isle, S-I-L-E, even though Ireland comes from a completely different root, shouldn't have that S in it, but someone's trying to kind of make sense of the language, trying to make sense of spelling, and we see this ambiguity, we see this ability to try and make sense of things throughout the history of English orthography, but probably most interestingly during kind of that period after the scientific revolution. Just a quick note on those Latin and Greek root words and how they link to the scientific revolution. We see this, and even more when we look into vocabulary that relates specifically to science. If we look at the nouns and verbs that we associate with science, a rough estimate, more than 90% of them contain Latin and Greek root words. And I think that speaks to this idea that I mentioned a moment ago. But yeah, it's morphology that is incredibly valuable. Teaching prefixes, so prefixes, so and suffixes, so different affixes in other words, but also teaching root words, teaching bases, etc. It's just fascinating stuff. A kid can come across a word like unassisted and have never seen it before, but they've come across assist in football, and so they have a vague sense that it means to help. They've seen in, unmerciful or whatever it might be. They've seen full in joyful or beautiful, and they can start to join the dots and say, well, I've never seen this word before, but by understanding the chunks of meaning that are within it, maybe I can get somewhere towards an understanding of it.
Just a quick little shout out for the YouTube channel, Rob Words. Great little YouTube channel, all about etymology, where words come from. If you want to know, well, why is there a G in sign, like he knows why. And I think, he touched on a few examples. I think Chris mentioned there as well. So definitely worth a little a watch, a subscribe, whatever it is that people do these days. I don't know.
It's really interesting because I think the languages on this particular part of the British Isles seem to be more susceptible to the influences of outside languages than others, because I've definitely read that Irish only took very specific fish or water-based words from the Norse invaders, despite arguably having more of an opportunity to sort of cross-pollinate both cultures. For instance, Ireland has a very, very big imprint of that time, whereas perhaps more people have visited this part of the British Isles throughout history, if that makes sense. For instance, the Romans never went to Ireland, so you don't have a lot of that. And so, and I'm thinking perhaps like German and French, would they be as willing to take on, or have they been over the, obviously it's not a sentient decision, but it feels like the people here over the ages have been willing to bring these languages in, right back from, I'm thinking the Saxons who came over with the Utes and stuff. That's almost your base language for what we have now, and then over time that has been built on. I don't think we need to go into the history and much more, because I did have a question about the history, but I think we've sort of nailed that But yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do you guys get that impression? Any studies into the susceptibility or the willingness of the Britons, or I don't know, the Saxons to get on board?
I mean, certainly no research, just connecting some dots and possibly getting 5 here, but obviously Germanic, Italic, Celtic, they all stem from Proto-Indo-European, so they will all have cognates to some degree. So it kind of makes sense in my mind that there is probably something about that means that there is a degree of susceptibility between those languages, given that they have an original ancestor, this kind of Proto-Indo-European. That then comes into to what extent does an invading force that then kind of wipes out your whole tribe and sets up who didn't have a writing system, and this invading tribe settled and did have a writing system, and then so therefore Romanized or brought their culture to it. So I think there's probably linguistically potential there. It would be just an interesting one to find out what are those kind of core factors that actually make those languages more susceptible. Is it something like these social factors like literacy, or is it the extent to which the invading forces did take place? Because I think it's quite an important one. We talk about a bit of Latin, a bit of Greek, a bit of Norman French, some Germanic languages as if they're like definites, as if they're like real like kind of cutoff points. But certainly for English, the Romans left. Many Romans still decided to stay in England at the what was England at the time when the Anglo-Saxons came over, and so there was this whole kind of mishmash and kind of mixing going on there. So maybe that might have something to do with it. So I think that's quite an important one to note about this whole thing, is like when we talk about this marriages of languages, then they're not sharp, definite. It all stopped at this point, and then something new took over. There was long overlapping periods where more change actually happened.
I mean, as fascinating as that all is, how does all this potentially impact the teaching of early reading and spelling?
The first thing to note is that the orthographic depth that we've mentioned of English as an alphabetic orthography, this idea that the relationships between graphemes and phonemes, between letters and sounds, in other words, is really complex, has implications for how we teach this stuff. Well, the first thing being that it's going to be particularly difficult for children to recognize these connections to begin with, but also that we're probably not going to be able to teach all of these connections as well. So there are 2 implications. The first of which is that we need to think really carefully about how the connections between letters and sounds are taught. We undoubtedly need a curriculum that sets out the scope and sequence of the relationships or correspondences between letters and sounds. In other words, we need to teach phonics, and we need to do so systematically. I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear me say that. But beyond that, because there is this complexity, it also means that while phonics and explicitly teaching these correspondences is still a wonderful and useful thing to do throughout education, that's not going to be how pupils learn the breadth of English orthography. It's very unlikely they are going to learn the relationships in a word like quinoa, or in the relationships in a word like yacht, through a phonics program, or perhaps through explicit teaching at all. They're going to learn that through the breadth of reading experience. And so this means that there are these like 2 essential components for teaching word recognition. A systematic phonics, so that pupils are given like a jump start to understanding the basics of this complex code, this deep orthography, and then a great deal of at first guided and then as supplementing that independent text experience, so that they learn the rest, the depth, or as much as they possibly can of the rest of English orthography. And you can't do things well without both of those components. There are some pupils who will learn the basics of the relationships between letters and sounds enough to get going purely through experience, purely through a parent reading to them and pointing at the words. And those children are very lucky, but that's not going to work for everyone. So we need systematic phonics, and we also need a real breadth of experience when it comes to teaching those relationships, or it comes to learning those relationships between letters and sounds. We can, of course, and should supplement that with explicit teaching of morphology. We've talked repeatedly about how these chunks of meaning are visible in a lot of cases within our writing system. So teach it. Teach prefixes, teach suffixes, teach how they are commonly spelled, teach what they mean. Teach Latin and Greek root words. Think about how that's going to be done. Now, that might be part of a curriculum and probably should be a key part of your spelling curriculum, but it's also informal. It's also, you're coming across a word in a book and you're not, and people ask what it means, or you want to explain it. Point to the chunks of meaning that you recognize within that word. Don't just leave it as a whole word. If you, as a teacher, can informally, with pupils, break it down into components and help them see the patterns within language, as well as what that word means as an individual thing. I guess alongside that as well is the usefulness of spelling voice. We've already talked about Wednesday. How much easier is it to teach that and to understand that and to remember that spelling if, as well as knowing it's pronounced Wednesday, when you come to spell it, you think of it as Wednesday. And the use of a spelling voice, I think, is a really valuable thing to do. I think arguably we could also say that it's worthwhile teaching spelling patterns. So mostly these are things that you don't see rather than things that you do. So when you see a kid spell a word like live or love or have just with the V as the last letter, it's worth saying to them that it's really rare for us to end words in English orthography in our writing system with a V. And where we do, these are abbreviations like dev for a developer, or slang like love, spell L-U-V for a particular purpose. But we can point out these things and say, yeah, that doesn't happen in English. That almost never happens in the English writing system. And these patterns are kind of quite a useful thing to kind of sensitize pupils to. So in short, teaching phonics systematically, making sure that pupils have a real breadth of experience, at first guided and then over time and independent as well as that. Teaching morphology explicitly, thinking about the use of a spelling voice when teaching spelling, and considering the spelling patterns within a language are probably kind of the key implications of all this stuff.
It's interesting you chose quinoa. I think that's the final screener question when you join MI6. Anybody who reads it aloud, quinoa, they get shown a different door and they're not allowed back in. Can't be trusted written on their form.
And then you pass, and then you accidentally, you on your way out, you accidentally say hyperbole instead of hyperbole, and then they regret their decision to accept you into MI6.
Yeah, I must have been in my late 20s, well, no, early 20s. It was definitely university, and it was because it's on a big sign, I think, in some chain, and I had no idea how it was pronounced.
Yeah, me neither. What to add? That's pretty systematic. I think there's a few things. Obviously, it depends how early we mean early reading here. I think there are researchers out there who think that the phonics side of this can be taught through kind of a study of morphology, and that would be a far better way for children to initially learn phonemes, because we're, I don't think we've actually mentioned it, but most people studying linguistics kind of agree that English isn't a phonemic language, it's a morphophonemic language, so it kind of contains morphology, and it's a bit of phoneme as well, a bit of phonics as well, because it's represented by the phoneme. And so there are kind of researchers out there who think, well, because it's morphophonemic, let's not hide that straight away and let's kind of go in as the morpheme. It's not a position I agree with, but that it does give credence to the fact that, we shouldn't hide away from this morphological layer that is the English language. I think what I'm just getting kind of from classroom practice, what I always find kind of interesting is that the morphological structure of a word does not necessarily marry up to the syllabic structure of a word. And so a nice kind of activity that you can get kind of kids to do, and it's kind of quite important, is that, certainly through quite a few, I think, phonics programs, we talk about, syllabifying and syllabification to kind of, as Chris said, with that spelling voice, they can really kind of hear each syllable. And that's, really useful when it comes to the schwa. And, Chris and I will debate about the schwa for quite some time. I'm sure that, again, another episode for a podcast. But morphology, morphemes don't necessarily match up to syllable structure. And so a nice kind of activity that you might want to do is to kind of get kids to break up, particularly around year 3, year 4, is to get them to break words up into syllables, but also where appropriate, the morphemes, so they can kind of really kind of investigate and experiment, why that might be the case and how they're different. Because I think that's quite important. It's when you kind of have the morphological hat on, it's kind of quite easy to forget that, syllables also exist. You kind of go straight in for the syllabic structure rather than looking for that morphological meaning. And again, I agree with Chris that, I would love for there to be a good scope and sequence that kind of takes the affixes that are in the national curriculum, that really kind of put those into a real logical order, thinking about what these high frequency affixes might be that aren't in there, as well as common Greek and Latin roots, because I really do think that would be well worth everyone's time. And it's why I'm a big proponent of Latin being the language that you choose to do for your foreign language, purely because kids will get that experience, because Latin is a sort of a distant relative of Spanish and French, which are the common languages that they tend to go to study in secondary school. Actually, I think an argument could be made that there will be cognates. So actually, despite the fact that they're learning Latin, that's still going to be really useful for children when they get to secondary school as well.
If I may just like to jump in a little bit on what you mentioned there about people suggesting that we should teach or should structure early reading instruction around the morpheme. Effectively, there is a suggestion that, okay, we need to teach phonics, or let me rephrase, we need to teach grapheme phoneme correspondences, and the best thing to do is teach them in a meaningful environment. And the way to do that is to look at the morphemes that are within language and teach word families. I think there's real value potentially in teaching pupils about word families early doors. And it wouldn't surprise me if down the road we see research that suggests that actually embedding morphology into early reading instruction is a really valuable thing. What I massively disagree with proponents of this idea is where they say that, okay, this is the way to effectively to structure a phonics curriculum. They wouldn't put it in those terms. They would say this isn't phonics because they have their own idiosyncratic view of what phonics is, which doesn't align with any definition I've seen elsewhere. Phonics is just the teaching of the relationships between graphemes and phonemes and how to use them, or the relationships between letters and sounds and how to use them. That's how it's defined. If you organize a phonics curriculum, you want it to be in a way that starts from relatively simple stuff and builds up to the complex. If you organize it around the morpheme and say, or word families that are built around morphemes, you end up introducing inevitably complex, unpredictable stuff at the very beginning. You end up with a curriculum that isn't aiming to start with the simple and incrementally build up to the more complex, which in any other area of education we would say is not a very sensible thing to do. So why someone would think it would be sensible at the start of reading education, I don't know. But yeah, I definitely think there's room for more morphology in early reading instruction. And as I say, it wouldn't surprise me if down the line we see research that suggests that there is a way for this to be embedded. But yeah, not a fan of that generally.
This has been a classic Terapia bread and butter. Get 50 minutes out of a topic that people would thought impossible to get 50 minutes out of. But as much as I've enjoyed it, how much of this do teachers need to know?
So I think it's really useful for teachers to have a sound grasp of what a phoneme is, what a grapheme is, what a morpheme is, and the role that they play in English orthography. Now, if they forget the word orthography and just talk about our writing system, that's absolutely fine. It's not a problem. But understanding how our writing system works, I see as fundamental to being as capable as you can possibly be in teaching, reading, writing and spelling, regardless of the age of the pupils you work with. I think it helps to understand the depth of English orthography, and thus potentially to some extent where that comes from, so that we recognize why it might be that pupils will struggle and why we need to persevere. I think all of the practical implications that come from this stuff are obviously things that teachers need to understand. And I think it's easier to remember the practical implications and to not go off the rails with them if you know where they come from. You don't just end up teaching morphology as this separate, almost like distilled subject. You're teaching it as a real life component of how we use our writing system. The short answer then is, I think we spend most of our teaching time, to some extent, trying to help pupils become experts in English orthography. We might not put it in those terms, but we're getting them to learn how to read it. We're getting them to learn how to write it. And so I don't think there's any wasted time in learning more about how that orthography actually works.
I agree with Chris. Like, there's lots of niches that we've talked about. Like, do I want English primary school teachers to have a test on like how English language like came to be? No, I don't. Do I want them to know that it's made up of the smallest unit of sounds, the phoneme, and within that there are these kind of larger units of sound that carry some meaning? Yes, I do. Do I want them to know which of these I want them to teach? Yes, I do. Would I like there to be a curriculum that says, here are some good bets because they're high frequency in tier 2 language, or in this corpus of literature that's designed for key stage 2, key stage 3 children? Like, these are the highest percentage of affixes that we used, and so make sure they know what those mean. Absolutely. Anything more than that is a lovely bonus. I think people should. But do they need to? Modal verb there. No.
Yeah, totally agree. In terms of, what teachers absolutely need to know, there is a bare minimum around kind of understanding of phonemes, graphemes, morphemes, practical implications relating to those. That is absolutely fine. One thing I would say is that there's a lot of talk in education about curriculum, and we talk about it in depth, and we kind of talk around it in the end, and we end up completely forgetting that there are incredibly valuable subjects that just barely get a look in, mainly because of historical accident. If we were designing a curriculum from scratch, the idea that philosophy and economics and psychology wouldn't figure in most people's education at all until they get to A-level would be absurd, I think, to most people. And yet it happens. I would argue that linguistics, understanding a bit about our language, how it works, how it relates to our writing system, is one of those things that's worth dropping into the extra bits of the curriculum. It might not have a subject, but why not have that knowledge so you can support your pupils to understand these bits and pieces? I think back in the day, it used to be called the hidden curriculum, and I'd be perfectly happy for bits of linguistics, some of the stuff perhaps that we've talked about today, to be part of that hidden curriculum across primary schools.
Very quickly, I would love, there's that unit of work that you can do in Key Stage 2 history, which is like you take a theme or a topic from like 1066. I might be a bit naughty and have a couple of lessons that go just before 1066. When I say just before, a couple of thousand years, not too much. But literally that is like the history of writing and reading, because I think that'd be a really interesting topic from a historical perspective, because you can go back, not only can you go back to revisit some of those ancient civilizations and regular civilizations that you've taught about, but you can kind of add that extra layer of depth and understanding that comes with then studying, and that which Chris and I have talked about.
Wonderful. I mean, I think the more you know, the more you can use it in your instruction and your planning. I think that's what's come across to me, because lots of the incidental stuff feeds your focus in other areas, in the less incidental and the more sort of impactful stuff. So I think it's really important. And like I say, I certainly enjoyed it. It was like going back to basics, and I'm looking forward to the next chance to really tear the English language apart. I'm trying to think what that might be. But until next time, all I have to do is say thank you very much. Thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Always a pleasure.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.
Right, I really need to go.
Don't say that. No. Let me give the positive spin on it. I don't want people to come away from the episode thinking they didn't need to know any of it for their teaching, because I disagree.